I am Patty Morrissey. I had about 20 years in the Pentagon working strategic planning, and 9 of that was information operations. Um, that kind of translates into when I started doing it was 1995 when I was just a mere baby. But the challenge then was how is warfare changing and how do we sort of shift our focus from blowing up everything we can to how do we win um, by being smarter, by making the enemy blind, deaf, and dumb. And so there's a lot that I carry forward from that 9 years of experience, 8 of it with the Joint Staff and 1 with the Director of Net Assessment, Andy Marshall, who a lot of people do know very well in the national. Yeah. On the first information warfare net assessment when we were trying to figure out what the heck it was. But I guess what I bring to this conversation is rooted in a lot of that and thinking about how we how we plan and execute more strategically to win that larger global competition, right? And it's much broader than we have traditionally talked about warfare. And so I'm going to discuss a little bit more tomorrow how my company, Global Foresight Strategies, is trying to systematically get our heads around the complexity of that, of thinking through the full spectrum of tools that Russia is applying, not just against Ukraine as the front right now, but globally to increase their power to maximize their influence in the world. And it's not a model that any of us in this room, I think, would be be willing to accept, right? So there's so much at stake. I don't know if you all saw the article. I think it was just in the last couple days that Hans Zenedijk and two other authors. Sorry, it's not on the top of my head. In Foreign Affairs, it is an incredible summation of what's at stake for Europe, for the world. I've been communicating to my non-national security expert friends and family that we have a potential World War III situation if the U.S. doesn't step up. So the broader point I wanted to make in this discussion is that we are in a global war. It's got many fronts, right? We've discussed the energy front and the need to quickly shift and finally wake up from the fossil fuel addiction and do things differently. And from the U.S. perspective, I've sort of been watching from afar how amazing it seems the Europeans have adapted. I think it was Lenka that kind of pointed out that we did a pretty good job with the resilience of being able to stay afloat with the quick shift in energy supplies. So I guess kudos on that front of the war. A lot more work to be done, but it sounds like people are really working that. I think the main front that I would like to speak to is the unbelievable success of Russia on the disinformation front. We all know there's an elephant in this room, and his name's Donald Trump. The willingness of him to carry the central message of Putin that the U.S. and European relationship isn't important, that Ukraine's not important, that this polarization messaging that constantly is using the internet as its delivery platform with these incredibly, I would say, potentially lethal messages in terms of the politics in the U.S. You saw how long it took us to approve that Ukrainian aid package. It was, for me, humiliating how long that took. So with what's at stake and the politics in the U.S., which were in lots of reporting, long studies, very clear that Russian disinformation has had a massive impact on US politics. So we need to work on our own vulnerabilities in that area. But I would say that that is sort of the most strategically effective weapon that Putin has been able to use. And I'll save the rest of the full spectrum warfare talk I was going to give tomorrow and hand it over to you guys for filling in all the blanks.
That's good. Right, I'll go next, and then I'll let Jiri cover all the wonderful things that we'll have missed. But actually, Patty, I agree with a lot of what you're talking about. I mean, I would probably use the word global competition rather than warfare, but I appreciate the use of that term. I suppose working for Rand, it would not be appropriate for me to use that word, but there we go. I think if you look at global disorder, we are very clearly in a time where there's a lot of change around global politics. And there is this, I mean, we are almost seeing a deglobalization in some areas, particularly when you look at competition between the United States and China. And I think as you watch that competition play out between those two great powers, it does raise an interesting question about what happens to everybody else. Because I think the default American approach is often, well, you're with us or you're against us. And I think that probably could work with Western powers with shared values. It's a bit harder in other parts of the world. So when you look at where the Middle East might go, where countries in Africa have gone with respect to, supporting Ukraine, opposing Russia, thinking about where one goes with global energy transition, China's appetite for fossil fuels continues largely to be met by the Middle East. And so I think there's an interesting question about kind of what that looks like. And then the question of kind of, does one try to decouple in that relationship or look just to de-risk? I mean, my personal view is decoupling is almost impossible and probably not advisable, but de-risking is probably something we really need to do. There's also the role of technology in how all of this is evolving. And of course, technology is moving at pace. And there's interesting questions about who sets the rules. And I'm going to be slightly flippant here, but I think I'll make a point. Because when you look at technology, it's the US by and large that tends to do a lot of the innovating. It's the Europeans that tend to do a lot of the regulating. And it's the Chinese that do a lot of the benefiting. And the UK sits on the side and says, I would like to do all three of those things. Tony, yes? Yep, there we go. And I think, that is not fully true, but I think that there is an interesting question about how one manages technology, how one benefits from technology, and what the right balance is between regulation, control, innovation, freedom, markets, et cetera. There's also the question about global commitment to a global world and probably a Western commitment to Western values. I think Patty illustrated it nicely when she talked about, there is a lot of wavering in the United States at the moment. I mean, not only in the Congress, but I think you also are starting to see it in the White House because there's some political pressures around November around, support for traditional U.S. allies. I think in the UK, it's even though I sound American, it's probably best for you to think of me as a UK speaker because I've lived in the UK for the last 20 years. There is a lot of public apathy around Ukraine, and there's probably quite a lot of public apathy around global competition with China. It was very interesting. There was Well, it wasn't a public debate because the public didn't want to engage with it, but an interesting discussion about if things really turn hot, would the UK public support a draft? People being required to join the armed forces. And my conclusion listening to that debate was absolutely not. And we are a little bit lazy and we are a little bit divided in the West around supporting values that we traditionally have supported for a number of years. I was going to talk a lot about how I think war is changing. Jiri covered many of those things, so I won't. But I will pick up the point around, particularly if you think about strategic security and defense choices, thinking about industrial policy and defense industrial policy. It is interesting, particularly in the context of Ukraine. The Russian economy is on a war footing. The Ukrainian economy is not on a war footing, and the Western economy is certainly supporting Ukraine, is certainly not on a war footing either. And I think there is a real need, particularly in Europe, because of all the things you talked about, Jiri, around different structures, different responsibilities, to really think about how one could get consensus around industrial policy and make supportive investments and decisions around those technologies, some of them very, very simple, that are needed to support what's happening in Ukraine now and what might be needed to support going on. And then just the final thing I will say, and I probably touched on it a little bit around global or Western commitment. It is pretty extraordinary, I think, looking at the conflict in Ukraine, that the Ukrainians are in the position they're in at all. They should not be. The Russians have every advantage, people, technology. And what's made the difference? And I think one of the things which has really made the difference is the Ukrainian people have a will to fight that one does not see on the other side. And it's important to think about how one can maintain that will to fight and how far that extends in other places across Europe. And maybe I'll finish there, and Jiri can pick up.
Thank you very much. And Patty, you mentioned the legendary Andrew Marshall, and so you probably know Diego Ruiz Palma, who worked for the Net Assessment Office for 10 years, and then I met him at NATO, and we had a lot of discussions about his experience. And after the annexation of Crimea, actually, we had a chat, and I said, Diego, do we have something at least remotely similar at NATO level as that net assessment? Because we should start it. We should start it, because we were getting quite, I would say, sometimes conflicting intel information about Russia. On one hand, and it was coming from the services from our region, and that actually they were already around 2012, 13, 14, on the way of preparations for a future big war around 2025. This was denied by others, and because the Central Eastern Europeans were seen as a paranoid sort of nations. So just, on this, because, and then actually Diego somehow managed to introduce elements of net assessment into the into the ways how NATO services were started, or I would say transformed their ways in looking at Russia. Now, industrial policy. There is a recently adopted European Defense Industrial Strategy, and now there is a European Defense Industrial Program being discussed. There are more and more incentives and this is the crucial problem of European defense industrial and technological base, is its fragmentation. But it is fragmented because the demand is fragmented. So first step actually to really step up or ramp up and I would say consolidate European defense industrial and technological base must come or impulse must come from the demand side in terms of larger programs, using more money. I mean, we have European Defense Fund, which is fine, supporting research and development, but it's 8 billion over 7 years. So it's not enough. We do a lot in our agency with the member states. We are an intergovernmental agency, so we have a lot of projects, but still this is very marginal. What we need is really, first of all, a consolidation on the part of the demand, and this is extremely difficult. We see problems with the big projects such as Future Air Combat System, FCAS, Germany, France, and others, or the main battle tank. So okay, so that's first thing, and this second thing actually is indeed, and again, this is also part of the programs and strategies that are now being prepared. And by the way, we had excellent discussion, and we're also inspired in that respect now from the US. We had excellent presentation of the US defense industrial strategy, and very similar problems: security of supplies, shortages of but also shortages of qualified workforce, critical dependencies in terms of critical materials and components, etc., etc. There is another problem in Europe, and that's that actually last year around 75% of all procurement by EU member states actually was realized outside the EU, and only around 20% of the production of the European defense industrial base actually was realized within the EU. You know, so this is something that should be, and here strategic autonomy. Yeah, this would be strategic autonomy, which is rather the capacity to. I mean, I don't like the notion of strategic sovereignty. It's too much, but autonomy, I think, reasonable autonomy, pragmatic autonomy, yes. We also need, and this is I will finish with this, actually a reasonable level of strategic autonomy and operational autonomy for situations where actually US and or NATO will not be involved, and we are now all we all are mesmerized by Ukraine, but things are happening in MENA, Middle East, North Africa, Sahel. Yeah, we are now actually leaving Sahel, and already Russia and China are there. So for me, strategic autonomy is something pragmatic, capacity to act in situations autonomously, where in our backyards, where US and or NATO are not involved. Collective defense for NATO, certainly, but at the same time, I mean, even if we have Biden continuing, this second administration will not be so friendly and converging with the EU, and we don't know whether who will be there actually next year in the White House. So we need to be ready and prepared for this. And this is not against NATO. I mean, 23 now member states of EU are allies in NATO. All capabilities that we develop in the context of European programs are fully compatible, using same standards, interoperability, those STANEX standardization agreements as in NATO. But again, I mean, there is a pivot of the US towards China, clear for years already, will continue, and we must be ready for that. Yeah.
Can I just pick up one point on the European industrial piece? So in 2018, 2019, I led a study for the European Commission, effectively looking at how does one create a European defense industrial base? There was no political will in the Commission. So sorry, let me rephrase that. There was no political will among the people that commissioned the work from us that they wanted the words European Defense Industrial Strategy. So what we had to call it was a strategic approach. but it contained all of the pieces that you talked about, alignment, focus on capabilities, but also looking a bit on how do you then drive the skills and capabilities and facilities also on the supply side, because it does take us a very, very long time to build those up. But I was very pleased to see when the recent defense industrial strategy was published, it was very consistent with, well, all of the things that you talked about and some of the things that we talked about. So
Do you want to give a last comment and then we'll move?
Yeah, just a quick one. Still on? Okay. And it just struck me as I was listening to you guys about industrial policy, which is critical to getting, the hard power items onto the field, but without the consideration that we need to have in our discussions about our weaknesses on other fronts, especially the vulnerability to polarizing messages and the question of how we help create standards for the truth, like that it's not okay to spread lies. It's not, and I just think that's a conversation we need to have. And we started picking at it this morning a little bit. And I think in Michael's presentation, that really made me think about that. Like how do we create standards of ethics and value around information, because it's being used as a weapon, and it's a very toxic weapon, and it can undermine everything we just talked about with the unity required to have industrial policy that does support our common defense. So that's what I want to say. Thanks.
Thank you so much.